So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think apologies for that technical glitch. I think we're all trying to figure out, this presentation technology that we now have to get used to. So my name is Anthony Muiyuro. I work for EY as a cybersecurity lead for East Africa. And today I'm just going to touch on what I feel would be key and just to possibly summarize also what my colleagues have mentioned. Very good presentations by my colleagues and peers, and I was following through and taking very good notes. I think there's so much to learn from what we are seeing in terms of where cybersecurity is headed and the new approach and what we need to basically prioritize. So mine is just to give a brief and definitely just touch on what ideally would be would define as the areas that we need to focus on, especially in the context of the latest development. And now COVID-19 is here with us. And what are some of the key learnings? And as a firm, we've taken a position based on the research that we've done. We recently did a survey as well, just to get to understand where our clients are prioritizing and in response to some of the latest developments in the market and also now in the context of COVID-19, what ideally is actually the approach that is effective in terms of strengthening the cybersecurity capabilities. And I've titled my presentation as the next wave for cybersecurity because, again, it speaks to most of the key salient tenets that we definitely need to have. And a lot of my colleagues have actually mentioned some of them, so I'm just going to be touching on the same. Just to start us off, and this is just for context, ideally what we've seen with COVID-19 is that it's definitely changed the way we work and how we are now transacting and also just how we're operating as businesses. And one of the key areas that we've also seen is that I think the technology of today can actually accommodate this new model of working. And some key statistics, and based on some of the materials I was looking at, is 75% and upwards to also 90% have actually been affected in terms of they have to change on how they operate. And they agree that, yes, indeed, COVID-19 has actually impacted them in a way. And it has actually also influenced a new way that they need to also operate and need to get their critical business activities done. 63% of organizations have already, and we're talking between upwards of 63% to 80%, have invoked a home policy and a teleworking. People now staff needs to work from home. And the question here is, what does this mean for businesses, and specifically from a cybersecurity perspective? What does this mean for cybersecurity practitioners and the people who are in the field? Now, mostly affected are some critical, I'd call them industries that have pretty much, this has been a big disruptor and has definitely caused a whirlwind in terms of operations, and travel, hospitality, mostly affected by this because, again, the business model is very heavy on the interactions that they've always been having and the kind of operations, be it traveling, be it hosting people, assembling, and all that. So they're hardly hit. But again, according to a Canadian Center for Occupational Health and Safety, and this was a very, very interesting view, that a typical pandemic is normally not a one-time event, that it can actually prolong in terms of the waves. And of course, you'd have probably a first wave, a second wave, and they normally say that this is it's normally worse than the initial one. So with that said, what we can look at is this can be a sustained way of working. And this COVID-19 basically just has shown us the need to pretty much adopt our businesses from a heavily on-prem working model to a remote working arrangement where people can actually connect remotely and people can still get critical tasks done. But the big question is this: what does this mean from a cybersecurity perspective? So I want to share a few insights that ideally I think is going to give it may not be very extensive, but it's going to just give a few perspectives. When you're looking at the operational resilience of a business and business resiliency, there are very many areas that we can look at. And as a firm, ideally, broadening the net beyond technology and cybersecurity, there are key 9 areas that ideally probably you need to look at that they're either affected or would influence how the business is going to operate. The first one is employee well-being. People need to, make sure that employees are well taken care of. They're not falling sick, and if they are, what are the arrangements thereof? And then, of course, talent and workforce and skills is a very big thing because you still need things to go on. And then, of course, customer safety and brand protection, all the way to insurance and financial recovery for businesses that really need to still be sustainable and still maintain operations just to make sense. But the focus of today will be what are some of the cybersecurity imperatives that we need to focus on. Now, one of the things that we also saw is that right now there's an uptick, and there was, especially from the periods of January, February, and March was actually a very busy season. And of course, even from a threat intelligence perspective, some of the cyber activities were actually higher then, because again, as we know, the typical profile of a cyber, some of these cyber actors is that they capitalize on opportunities and also calamities, because they're always very opportunistic in terms of how they launch some of these attacks. One of the things, and I think the reason that really exacerbates this is the fact that when there's panic in masses, I think a lot of emotion is driven, and people are very emotional. They want to, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety, and they really want to know what is actually going on and how can we be affected. For instance, recently what I got in the month of March, I got a phishing email, and ideally this was actually an attempt, and it spelled that there are new COVID-19 symptoms that are now manifesting. Now, as a typical human being, I would really want to know, are these symptoms, might I be having these symptoms, or I just, out of that need and out of that curiosity, I am lured to just opening that link. And this is me. And I will be very honest with you guys. I almost opened it until I just looked at the link and then just did a quick virus total scan. And I saw that it was actually a malicious link. But what am I saying is that when you have such an occurrence and such an event, it actually makes some of these attempts easier for people to fall prey to. Now, that is that. What we are now looking at is this uptick of some of these cyber attacks. Like in the banking sector, there was a recent research that said that there's been an uptick and an increase of 238% of some of these cyber attacks related to COVID-19 alone. All right. And from the periods of January to all the way to April, we actually had 16,000 new COVID-19 related domains. I would argue that some of them are legitimate. Probably people in the research space, they just want to dispense information. But I would also argue that some of them, and this is very true, are not really genuine. Of course, they have nefarious reasons as to why they really want to use those domains. Like I said, I recently got an attack, an attempt just to fish me out based on, it was packaged in a way that it was very easy for me to open it up. And according to Gmail security report, they have 18 million daily malware and phishing emails related to COVID-19. I mean, it's quite a significant number, but it can actually tell you that this is something that, of course, it's happening in scale. And right now, of course, there's now a dip into the same. But in the earlier months, you could tell that email-based attacks were actually very high, and 667%. Of course, COVID-19 related still of spear phishing attacks. Because, like I mentioned earlier, some of these things are very optimistic, opportunistic in terms of right now you have the situation, they use it, they capitalize on that. But now since you have your staff working from home, and ideally, and there's a big emphasis on making sure that you're able to still connect employees. But the problem now comes also in terms of when you look at also the enterprise setup, and I would argue that the network was pretty much not designed for that level of load, because we'd be talking about 70% of upwards, even 90 or 80% of your staff working from home. That's very big load. Now, unless you have a very effective VPN setup, this can cause issues. But also, what are some of the security implications of also having that level of load and people who are working off the premise, and especially when you're talking about monitoring and being able to make sure effective endpoint security awareness and trainings and all that. What are some of the areas that you need to focus on? Because again, now organizations need to have a blend of working models where you have people working from home. A typical enterprise, you'd have, of course, you have the critical staff that they still need to work on the environment with proper safeguards still in place. So it's very essential that cybersecurity practitioners put this to the fore, because the business will definitely want to continue to work, but not at the expense of security. And this is where we need to come in very strongly and preach the gospel of, we feel that these are the areas that need to be prioritized. So how does this come into place? And the big question now is, what are some of the things that need to be prioritized by organizations, and people need to really pay a very keen attention on? Because again, we are moving from where cybersecurity has always been seen as a cost center. And I like one of my colleagues that presented earlier on how CISOs have always been perceived. I think it's very important that we hammer in the message that the CISO is a transformational agent to the business, or rather should actually enable the business transform, but do so in a secure way. And this is actually what we need to come out very clearly in terms of what are we positioning as the value, as the value generators, where the business is creating value, but their role here would be, how do we secure this value? And my good friend April also came into, very strongly in terms of how should the CISO be looking at this. And I like the whole Babylonian, analogy, because it's very relevant in terms of the perception before, and now what is the perception that the new, CISO of the day should actually have, and what should really drive this function. And by CISO, I mean anybody in that seat that would actually provide, this advisory, or provide this, oversight for the business, just to make sure that it's always secure. Because today we're talking about, technology automation, and where we have this level of automation, we need to secure value, because that is the new dispensation of where businesses are now thriving. So moving on, what is the current and what we need to focus on as businesses, and also as cybersecurity practitioners and IT practitioners as a whole? What is the now dimension? And as a firm, we've actually bucketed it into, 3 areas that we definitely focus on, which is the now, the immediate, what should be done within the next, 3-6 months, or, nothing more than a year. What should be prioritized? And then, of course, the next. And the next is where we need to place these capabilities that are going to enhance the maturity, the cybersecurity maturity of the organization. And basically, this is more medium term, in terms of, like I said earlier, a typical pandemic can take upwards of maybe 2-3 or so waves. So again, you're looking at an extended period of time where it's not just a one-time event, but it's actually something that needs to be looked at from the lens of, this can go on, like 2 years, 1 year, or so months. So the next dimension is actually where we look at this. And then, of course, the beyond is beyond the pandemic. What are the lessons learned, and what are some of the things that cybersecurity functions need to have in place? So in the immediate term, when you talk about policies and procedures, and this is how do you enable like remote working, secure remote working for that matter, for the business. So again, most organizations have actually had what we define as a BCM, but of course, sometimes it can actually be a document. But what we've seen, and even just talking to our clients in the market, is that this is the time that that document has actually been tested. This is the time that they've known all the way we've actually had something that said that stuff can work remotely. Because for the longest time, the typical disaster was the primary site is down, and maybe it's a force majeure or something that ideally would be like an earthquake, but now you have an alternate site that is 15 kilometers from your primary site, but it will still be heavy on people assembling. But now we have a situation where people cannot assemble. It's against all the tenets of a secure, or rather safety guidelines, to have that number of people together. So ideally now it's a result to, you need to work remotely, preferably at home. somewhere where you know you are safe from any crowd. So what are some of these teleworking policies that you have in place? And again, this is something that needs to be looked at on what's effective. And there are a lot of lessons learned. I feel in the past 2-3 months, I feel many organizations have actually learned a lot in terms of how can they revamp some of these things. Awareness and training, and this is a big thing. Like I mentioned, I was a very good example. I'll honestly tell you that I almost fell prey to that thing because, again, I was very curious on what is this new manifested symptoms that I need to be cognizant of, or am I manifesting them, and that kind of a thing. So you need to really train your users so that they know what to do, because when humans are emotional, they are not rational. They respond to stimuli such as fear or excitement. So you pretty much need to drill the message in terms of they really get it. And again, awareness and training is something that needs to take an empirical approach. And what I mean is this: you need to train your users in a way that not only are you able to conduct continuous assessments to test them if they are able to, to detect, or rather they get the message, but you also need to be very creative and also just give them some level of even scoring. I've seen organizations where if you are launching an e-learning and possibly you do a phishing simulation immediately after, and the same person who underwent the e-learning falls prey to that, you actually make them attend a classroom session, and of course this becomes very mandatory. And I've seen in some instances, which is also very extreme, where this is also tied to like a KPI so that it means something to them. Again, you need to also look at endpoint security, and this is where your people now are working remotely from home. What is that arrangement? How does it look at? This is very key because, again, EDR is actually now one of the best bets in terms of making sure some of, especially the staff who are working from home, are well secured. Secure collaboration platforms. Users are now working from home and they now need to use some of these things. So you need to look at how do you make sure that your users are using the best, or rather the company approved, secure collaboration platforms. When we've heard about some of the things that have been going around, but organizations, as we are embracing the new models of some of these communication tools, I think one of the best things is actually to do a risk assessment. Yeah. Of course, the conspiracy theories aside, it needs to be very objective. You need to do a risk assessment of some of these tools, because now you're talking about security, but you're also talking about privacy. And a good place to start is also from a regulation perspective, what are some of these regulations that even those providers are compliant or on their way to getting fully compliant? And I think it's within your rights to gain that level of information. Any serious vendor, and if it's an enterprise suite that you're subscribing to, they should give you this level of information. So this should be done in such a secure way, because I saw the CBK in Kenya, they actually launched, they sent a guideline to the industry that they need to, that they are now embracing virtual working, and they're embracing also secure, video conferencing, and to the level that an AGM can actually be assembled virtually. But the risk therein is the level of exposures. And we had this Zoom bombing, they call it, attacks, and it was very serious because I personally was in one session and then it got hacked and the people were showing some illicit content. So you really don't want that to happen, especially in something like an AGM, because the next thing the CISO is going to be asked, what were you doing? How comes you never ensure that we are secured? And the other interesting thing is that, especially here in Kenya, we have people that we call Kenyans on Twitter. Should something like that happen, it's going to be all over the place. And of course, from a reputational perspective, that's going to be bad for the organization. So that is something that needs to be looked at, because the downside is some of those opportunistic attacks, as they were, can actually happen. And then, of course, from a third-party perspective, you always need to do your third-party risk assessments, but also your third-party criticality assessments. Who are these people that you need? And then how secure are they? Because again, they're also businesses. The same challenges the organization is facing, they're also facing them. So, and out of that, they can also introduce some level of exposures that can actually end up into your environment, especially when you're talking about, some of the supply chain attacks. And then, of course, augmenting your team with some third parties that can actually help you, because the immediate interest is to get the business running. The immediate interest is actually just to make sure that the business operation is actually sustained. So that is something that needs to be looked at from a secure perspective. But right now we're at a phase where I think we've hit auto cruise in terms of we are now from the immediate now, and now businesses have now understood and organizations have now understood that this is something that we need to sustain. And it has informed some of the investments that need to be made, which brings me to my second dimension, which is the next. And I believe we're actually at the very beginning in terms of just looking at this. And the first thing is, based on these changes such as remote working and our dependency on some third parties, as it were, you need to also look at your risk assessments. What are your current risks? And what is your cyber risk profile at the moment? Now, I think it would be a bit misleading if at all a risk assessment that was actually done a year ago, you're actually basing some of these decisions that you need to make at the moment based on that. Because again, the business has changed, the model has changed, and the context and the environment is actually very different at the moment. So you need to really do this continuously. And I mean, risk assessment should always inform your approach to some of these cyber investments and to your approach on how you're going to tighten your cybersecurity strategies. My colleagues earlier on mentioned a bit about, as a CISO, you need to also be driven, or rather you need to be informed by accurate risk assessments, not assumptions. I have seen interesting risk registers that are pretty much led by assumptions, because when you ask questions, ideally, you're not able to have substantive reasons as to how they, arrived at that level of conclusion. So this actually has to be done in a real time, in a continuous basis, but also it needs to be empirically informed so that you have the right level of view of what your risks are. And then, of course, you need to realign your cybersecurity strategies and also roadmaps. Again, now is where some of these documents are being tested in terms of what is the applicability of what you have against what needs to be had at the moment. I have seen situations where things like I mentioned, if it's endpoint security, strengthening it, probably it was bucketed to be a 2021 project. But I think in this context, that would not really be the best way to approach it, because endpoint security is one of the things that, especially with your remote working stuff, you need to make sure that the machines are now properly safeguarded. So this is something that needs to come in place. Again, you'll be looking at moving workloads to the cloud and I'm a big proponent of cloud, but you need to do it in a secure way. You need to do it in a governed manner where some of these questions around security and privacy are actually addressed. And this is something that can actually be looked at in the context of regulation, in the context of some of the, and earlier on, my colleagues also mentioned a bit about the data privacy. And for Kenya, we have our own act now. What are some of the imperatives there? Because it needs to be done so as to that, as to the relevant regulations and law. And then from a patching and upgrade perspective, patch management, of course, is one of the biggest solutions to some of the vulnerabilities that we normally have. So what is that arrangement that you pretty much need to have as a business? And I like what Adam mentioned earlier, especially, and I'm a big fan of Tenable. I've actually implemented it as well. And I think the fact of that you can actually be doing this in real time, and especially when you're talking about active scanning and passive scanning, so that some of these patches are actually applied on time. That is very key. That is very, very key, because you're talking about the enterprise servers, and even more importantly, especially in this context, end user devices. How do you make sure that if at all they're working off the environment and they do not have access to your, be it an EPO or whatever, how will they still make sure that, some of these things are, and even the GPU, some of these updates, critical updates, are received in real time? That is something that needs to be looked at, and some of the strategies should be informed by that. what investments should the organization make based on that? And then, of course, from a sourcing and third-party perspective, you need to look at how do you augment your team? How are you going to, make sure that, your organization is actually well sourced, just to make sure that it functions effectively. And then the beyond, and this is now the long term, because cybersecurity now should be positioned as a transformation agent or a function of the transformation journey, just to enable the new business reality, as it were. And this is where the CISO needs not to become the advisor in terms of, this is the approach that we need to take. But again, you should motivate that this should be done in a secure way. And then you need to realign some of the governance and some of the structures that you need to have to make sure that operationally this is effective and actually stands the test of time. And then, like I mentioned earlier, risk assessment should actually be done and should be prioritized. And one of the most important things that I want to mention as I close is you need to be able to capture key performance indicators and your key risk indicators. And this is very important. Peter Drucker says that you cannot manage what you do not measure. The only way you can improve your cybersecurity strategies and your cybersecurity capabilities is if you're able to capture and evaluate the key performance measures. And as EY, we've developed a tool called EY Shield, and we've been able to crack that model into how can you collect and how can you be able to do continuous assessments of some of these key performance indicators based on the key domains in your cybersecurity universe as it is. So that is very important. And lastly, and as I close, we have this sustainability model that pretty much is what we have, my view in terms of how businesses should definitely look at cybersecurity, putting everything together. And it's based on 4 very simple principles. The first one is you need to complicate the ability of any attacker just to achieve their objective. And this is maybe things like hacking. It can be an external person or even your insider threat, which is normally the biggest, like one of the reports that I saw being presented here. You also need to have effective detection capabilities. You need to have effective monitoring capabilities, be it a SOC, be it a SIEM, and it needs to be fit for purpose. And then incident response, which is very key. Now, playbooks, you need to kick them just kick them off, but also review them just to see if you're able now to effectively respond to an attack. And then education and training and awareness, which is a very big thing. Very key principles, very simplified. And I think that speaks to everything that we can talk when you're talking about the whole cyber universe. Those key principles speak to that. But at the heart of it is governance. And governance is how do you manage that some of these processes are pretty much relevant and they are adjusting to your priorities and they're able now to sustain the effectiveness over a period of time. And what are some of the changes that you need to do on a continuous basis? So ladies and gentlemen, I think that is just it from me. Very simple things that I'm happy to share. In case of any clarification or question, please you can throw in the chat, but also I'm gonna type in my details, my email address, and you can definitely reach out. So thank you very much, team. I think I'll end it from there.